He was known as the Cannon King, a man who inherited a bankrupt five-man workshop at age 14 and forged it into the largest industrial empire on Earth. This is the story of Alfred Krupp and the dynasty he built, a 400-year saga of steel, power, and war. From humble beginnings, the Krupp family rose to arm nations, revolutionize global transport with their seamless railway wheels, and create a vast welfare state for their workers. Yet, this legacy of innovation is forever shadowed by a darker truth. In the 20th century, Alfred's heirs made a fateful pact, placing their industrial might in the service of Adolf Hitler. The Krupp factories, which once built a modern world, became the arsenal of the Third Reich, powered by the suffering of over 100,000 slave laborers. This is a story of ambition, genius, and a catastrophic moral reckoning that culminated in the Nuremberg trials. Prepare to delve into the heart of the Krupp dynasty to witness their triumphs, their tragedies, and the staggering bloody cost of becoming the forge of the Reich. Our journey starts not with cannons, but with a blacksmith's hammer in the 16th century Germany. The Krupp dynasty began modestly with Arndt Krupp, a merchant who fled religious persecution to settle in the town of Essen. For 200 years, the family were respected local gunsmiths and traders, their potential dormant like the coal seams deep beneath their feet. But that potential was first watered not with innovation, but with tragedy. Our story truly begins in 1597, in a city of Essen ravaged by the Black Death. As the wealthy merchant families fled the city, the immigrant Arndt Krupp stayed. He bought up the property and businesses of the dead and the departed, often for pennies on the dollar. The foundation of the Krupp fortune was laid not in a forge, but in the midst of a plague. For the next generation, the business was survival, and the currency was war. During the devastating 30 Years' War that tore Germany apart, the Krupp family of gunsmiths honed their craft and their pragmatism. Records show they sold weapons to both sides of the conflict, the Protestant Union and the Catholic League. For the Krupps, business was always business, a philosophy that would echo with catastrophic consequences 3 centuries later. That changed in the early 1800s with Friedrich Krupp, a man obsessed with a single radical idea, cracking the English secret to high-quality cast steel. He poured his family's fortune into this dream, building a small foundry in 1811. But Friedrich was a better inventor than a businessman. He died young and bankrupt, leaving his 14-year-old son, Alfred, not a fortune, but a derelict workshop, a mountain of debt, and a single priceless inheritance, the secret of forging steel. It was from these ashes that the future Cannon King would rise. Imagine being 14 years old. Your father has just died, broken by his obsession. He has left you not a comfortable life, but a failing business and debts that could swallow your family whole. Most boys would have crumbled, but Alfred Krupp was not most boys. Thrust into a position of immense responsibility, he possessed an almost preternatural understanding of industrial processes and an unyielding iron will to succeed. He, along with his formidable mother, Therese, who managed the finances with a shrewd and steady hand, refused to let his father's dream die. Therese was the unsung hero of the Krupp saga. While Alfred became the face of the company, she was the one who negotiated with creditors, managed the books, and ensured the family did not starve. Together they made a pact to save the company. Alfred lived and breathed the foundry. He abandoned his formal schooling and went to work. He worked alongside his men, learning every facet of the process, his hands blackened, his face streaked with soot. He slept on a straw mattress in the workshop, his life consumed by a single goal, to vindicate his father's memory and to erase the shame of their near poverty. Where his father had been a visionary but impractical dreamer, Alfred was intensely focused and pragmatic. He mastered the technical details his father had pioneered and combined them with a ruthless business acumen. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to turn the company around. But success breeds rivals. As Krupp's reputation grew, so did that of his chief competitor, Jacob Mayer of the firm Bochumer Verein. The battle for the title of Germany's Steel King was fought at the great world's fairs. At the Great Exhibition in London, 1851, Alfred stunned the world by displaying a flawless 2-ton solid steel ingot, a feat previously thought impossible. It was a triumph. But just 4 years later in Paris, Mayer struck back, successfully casting a massive church bell weighing 15 tons. The rivalry pushed both men to ever greater feats of engineering, a relentless industrial arms race that would define German steel for the next half-century. Alfred Krupp learned a valuable lesson. To be the king, you must not only innovate, you must dominate. To achieve that dominance, Alfred first secured his foundation. He focused on producing exceptionally high-quality steel for specific niche products: steel rolls for minting coins, tools for craftsmen, and parts for machinery. The quality was exceptional, and word began to spread. Alfred immediately grasped that the future lay in innovation on a massive scale. In the 1850s, he became aware of the Bessemer process, a revolutionary new method for mass-producing steel by blowing air through molten pig iron to burn off impurities. It was fast, it was cheap, and it promised to make steel a common commodity, replacing iron in everything from rails to buildings. Alfred knew this was the future. However, German iron ore from the local region presented a unique and stubborn challenge. It had a high phosphorus content. This phosphorus made the steel brittle and useless, a phenomenon known as cold shortness. For most, this would have been a deal breaker. But for Alfred, it was a problem to be solved. He invested a fortune not just in licensing the Bessemer process itself, but in a relentless campaign of research and development. He hired chemists and metallurgists, and through a proprietary method of careful chemical manipulation and flux additives, he figured out how to neutralize the phosphorus. His dedication paid off spectacularly. He established Germany's very first Bessemer plant. The day the first Bessemer converter was fired up in Essen was a landmark in German industrial history. Imagine the scene: a massive pear-shaped vessel filled with molten iron, then a thunderous roar as compressed air was forced through the bottom. A spectacular shower of sparks and a colossal flame would erupt from the mouth of the converter as the oxygen in the air reacted with the carbon and impurities in the iron. After 20 minutes of this violent volcanic process, the vessel would be tipped, and out would pour a river of pure liquid steel. The roar of his Bessemer converters became the sound of Germany's industrial awakening, and it vaulted Krupp light years ahead of its domestic competitors. It was during the 1840s, even before the Bessemer Revolution, that Alfred made a pivotal strategic shift that would forever define the Krupp name. He began producing cast steel cannons. At the time, most artillery was made of bronze, a softer metal prone to wear and dangerous bursting. Steel was theoretically far superior, but casting a flawless massive barrel of steel without any cracks or imperfections was considered nearly impossible. Alfred, using the crucible steel methods his father had pioneered, achieved it. In 1847, he produced his first successful 6-pounder steel cannon. It was a technological marvel. He was so proud of it that he took it on a marketing tour to Paris and London, but the established military powers were unimpressed, clinging to their traditional bronze guns. The Prussian military was particularly skeptical. Undeterred, Alfred became a master of marketing as well as manufacturing. He staged spectacular demonstrations for foreign dignitaries at his private proving grounds, showcasing the awesome power and reliability of his creations. He famously demonstrated their strength by firing a cannon that had been deliberately overcharged, a test that would have caused any bronze gun to explode, but which the steel barrel withstood perfectly. Soon, armies across Europe and beyond took notice. Russia, Turkey, and even the initially hesitant Prussians became major clients. The Schleswig Wars, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, and most decisively, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 became brutal, effective advertisements for Krupp's steel artillery. The Prussian victory at the Battle of Sedan, which led to the capture of Emperor Napoleon III and the collapse of the French army, was largely attributed to the vast superiority of Krupp's steel breech-loading cannons over the French bronze muzzle loaders. Here's the tactical breakdown of that superiority. The French artillery was made of bronze and loaded from the muzzle. It was slow, inaccurate, and dangerous for its own crew. The Prussian artillery was Krupp's C-64 steel breech loader. It could be loaded from behind a protective shield, fired 3 times faster, and had a much longer range. At Sedan, the Prussian army encircled the French. Over 400 Krupp cannons were positioned on the hills overlooking the French army, completely out of range of the enemy's bronze guns. For hours, they rained down a relentless storm of steel. The French were trapped and systematically annihilated. Emperor Napoleon III himself was forced to surrender. It was a victory delivered by steel. The Cannon King had truly earned his moniker. By the 1880s, the company's output was staggering, with weapons accounting for approximately 50% of all production. The name Krupp had become synonymous with military might, but Alfred's genius wasn't confined to armaments. His restless mind was always seeking new applications for his superior steel. In 1853, he patented another groundbreaking innovation, the seamless forged steel railway wheel. Before this, railway wheels were typically made of cast iron or had welded steel tires, which were prone to cracking and catastrophic failure, leading to horrific derailments. Alfred developed a method to forge a wheel from a single block of steel, creating a product that was incredibly strong and durable. His logo, 3 interlocking rings representing the railway wheels, became a symbol of quality known around the world. This simple yet brilliant invention revolutionized transportation safety. It made railway travel faster, safer, and more efficient, and it propelled Krupp onto the global stage in a new way. The burgeoning railroads of the United States, hungry for reliable technology to span their vast continent, became enormous customers. Railroads like the New York Central and Illinois Central laid their tracks and ran their locomotives on Krupp wheels. He was building the world's infrastructure at the same time he was building its armies. Alfred Krupp, the ruthless Cannon King, also possessed a surprisingly progressive social conscience, at least for his era. He was a stern patriarch, an autocrat who demanded absolute loyalty, but he also understood that a healthy, stable, and dedicated workforce was the bedrock of his empire. He created what became known as the Kruppianer system, a cradle-to-grave welfare state for his employees. He built entire towns, or Siedlungen, for his workers, with clean, subsidized housing, schools, parks, and churches. He established company-owned stores that sold goods at fair prices, protecting his workers from price gouging. He created a comprehensive healthcare system with its own hospitals and doctors, and a pension fund to support workers in their old age. This wasn't pure altruism. It was a shrewd and calculated business strategy. A contented workforce was a productive workforce, less prone to strikes and the siren song of socialism, which Alfred utterly detested. However, this benevolence was coupled with an iron-fisted discipline. In return for these benefits, Alfred demanded absolute, unwavering loyalty. The Kruppianer was expected to be sober, diligent, and above all, loyal to the firm and to Alfred himself. He issued a general regulative, a 72-page document of rules that governed every aspect of a worker's life, both inside and outside the factory gates. Any hint of union activity or political dissent was ruthlessly crushed. He saw himself as the father of a great family, and he ruled it with a firm but, in his view, benevolent hand. The system worked. By the time of his death in 1887, the Krupp workforce had swelled to an astonishing 20,000 employees. The company he had inherited as a boy, with just 5 workers and a mountain of debt, was now the largest private company not just in the newly unified German Empire, but in the entire world. To house his own dynasty and to project his immense power, he built the Villa Hügel, a sprawling 269-room mansion overlooking Essen and his industrial kingdom. It was less a home and more a palace of steel and stone, a monumental statement of his success. Here he entertained kings, emperors, and statesmen from around the globe. Yet personally, he remained a reclusive and isolated figure, a notorious hypochondriac who was obsessed with his health and the security of his empire. Alfred Krupp had built an empire, one forged in steel, innovation, social engineering, and an unwavering belief in progress. He had transformed his family name from a local curiosity into a global symbol of power, leaving behind a legacy as hard, as brilliant, and as potentially dangerous as the steel he had mastered. He had created the arsenal of the new German Reich, tying the fate of his company inextricably to the fate of the nation and its military ambitions, a legacy his heirs would have to navigate in the even more turbulent century to come. When the great Alfred Krupp died in 1887, the torch of the dynasty passed to his only son, Friedrich Alfred Krupp. He inherited an industrial colossus, a global empire with a reputation for both unparalleled quality and fearsome power. The shadow cast by his father, the legendary Cannon King, was immense, and few expected the quiet, scholarly Friedrich Alfred to fill his shoes. Where Alfred had been a man of iron and fire, an obsessive industrialist who saw the world through the lens of a Bessemer converter, his son was a man of a profoundly different temperament. Friedrich Alfred was a man of science and the arts, a passionate and respected marine biologist. He was more at home on the deck of his research yacht, the Maya, exploring the depths of the Mediterranean than he was on the floor of a deafening steel mill. He was a generous philanthropist, a patron of music, and a quiet, sensitive soul. The Villa Hügel, once the austere fortress of the reclusive Alfred, was transformed under its new master into a vibrant center of culture, hosting scientists, artists, and concerts. Yet to underestimate him as a mere dilettante would have been a grave mistake. Friedrich Alfred possessed a keen intellect and a solid grasp of the business he had inherited. He understood that the world was changing, and he guided the Krupp Empire into new and vital sectors with a skillful hand. Recognizing that the future of warfare was not just on land, but at sea, he invested heavily in the Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel. Under his leadership, it was transformed into one of the world's premier naval construction facilities. Krupp began producing state-of-the-art hardened armor plating, powerful naval guns, and eventually entire warships, and the first experimental German submarines, or U-boats. This strategic move perfectly positioned the company to profit from the naval arms race that was escalating between Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany and Great Britain. Germany was determined to build a navy to challenge British supremacy on the waves, and Krupp became the primary instrument of that grand and ultimately fatal ambition. The forges of Essen and the shipyards of Kiel were now working in lockstep to build the sinews of a new German naval power. Friedrich Alfred, the gentle scientist, was proving to be a ruthlessly effective arms magnate in his own right, securing the company's dominance for a new generation. But beneath this veneer of industrial might and commercial success, a deeply personal and ultimately tragic story was unfolding. Friedrich Alfred found solace and perhaps a truer version of himself far from the grim industrial landscape of the Ruhr Valley. He was drawn to the sun-drenched idyllic island of Capri in Italy. It was a bohemian paradise, a haven for artists, writers, and expatriates from across Europe, a place where the rigid social and moral codes of Wilhelmina Germany felt a world away. On Capri, he could indulge his passion for marine biology, establishing a research station and exploring the famed Blue Grotto. He was a generous patron to the local community, and for a time he found happiness there. But he also indulged in another, far more dangerous pursuit. In the grottos and private villas of the island, shielded from the prying eyes of the German press, Friedrich Alfred engaged in homosexual affairs, often with young Italian men. In the conservative, hyper-masculine culture of early 20th century Germany, this was not just a private matter. It was a deeply scandalous secret that, if revealed, could destroy him utterly. For years, the rumors swirled in the salons of Berlin and the beer halls of Essen, but in 1902, the whispers grew into a public roar. A series of sensationalist articles, first in Italian newspapers and then, crucially, in the German Social Democratic newspaper Vorwärts, exposed his secret life on Capri in lurid, unforgiving detail. The scandal erupted into a national sensation. The exposé was almost certainly politically motivated. The Social Democrats saw Krupp as the ultimate symbol of the capitalist, imperialist system they opposed, and destroying the man at its head was a strategic masterstroke. The effect on Friedrich Alfred was devastating. He was publicly shamed, his private life laid bare for the judgment of a deeply intolerant society. The reaction from the highest echelons of power was swift and brutal. Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man obsessed with the performance of rigid masculinity and the public image of his German Empire, was personally and profoundly mortified. For one of Germany's most powerful industrialists, a man whose name was a national symbol, to be embroiled in a scandal of this nature was an intolerable stain on the nation's honor. The Kaiser, who had cultivated a personal relationship with Friedrich Alfred, felt a sense of deep betrayal. Publicly, he expressed his outrage, and privately, he made his displeasure known in no uncertain terms. The pressure on Friedrich Alfred became unbearable. He was trapped between the salacious headlines of Vorwärts, which relentlessly pursued the story, and the cold fury of his emperor. His health, never robust, crumbled under the immense strain. In November 1902, just weeks after the scandal broke in Germany, Friedrich Alfred Krupp died at the Villa Hügel. He was only 48 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke. The Krupp Company and the German establishment immediately closed ranks, presenting a united front that their great leader had been hounded to death by the gutter press, a martyr to slanderous political attacks. The Kaiser himself attended the funeral, delivering a thunderous speech in which he condemned the vile and slanderous accusations and posthumously defended Friedrich Alfred's honor. Yet the shadows of scandal and suicide clung stubbornly to his memory. Many believed then, and many historians believe now, that the sensitive, scholarly heir to the Steel Empire, ill-equipped for such brutal public humiliation, had taken his own life. The tragedy was immense, a deeply personal drama played out on the national stage, and it created a crisis of succession that threatened the very future of the Krupp dynasty. The company, a symbol of German industrial power, a pillar of the state, now fell into the hands of his 16-year-old daughter, Bertha Krupp. Imagine the weight on her young shoulders. She was now the wealthiest heiress in Germany, the owner of the world's largest and most formidable industrial enterprise. But in the rigidly patriarchal society of Wilhelmina, Germany, the idea of a woman running such a company was unthinkable. The future of Krupp was a matter of national security. The Kaiser and his government watched anxiously. A suitable husband had to be found, and quickly. Not just a husband for Bertha, but a regent for the Krupp Empire. He needed to be from the right social class, politically reliable and capable of commanding the respect of the company's powerful directors and the German elite. After a careful and politically charged search, a candidate was chosen, Gustav von Bohlen und Halbach, a career diplomat serving in the Vatican. He was from an aristocratic family, known for his intelligence, discipline, and conservative principles. He was seen as a safe, steady pair of hands. In 1906, Bertha Krupp married Gustav. The wedding was a major affair of state, but it was an event that followed the wedding that truly underscored the unique importance of the Krupp name. In an unprecedented move, Kaiser Wilhelm II issued a special imperial decree, a law that would become known as the Lex Krupp. It permitted Gustav to append the Krupp surname to his own, becoming Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. This was more than just a symbolic gesture. It was a clear and powerful statement from the highest authority in the land. The Krupp dynasty was too crucial to Germany to be allowed to end. The name itself was a national asset, a symbol of industrial and military power that had to be preserved at all costs. Gustav, the career diplomat, was now officially a Krupp. He left the world of diplomacy behind and moved to the Villa Hügel to take the reins of the industrial empire. He was not an engineer like Alfred, nor a scientist like Friedrich Alfred. He was a political operator, a shrewd administrator, and he threw himself into his new role with ferocious determination, keenly aware that he was now the custodian of a legendary legacy. Gustav proved to be a masterful leader. He was politically astute, navigating the complex relationship between the company, the government, and the increasingly powerful military. He understood that Krupp's destiny was inextricably linked to Germany's global ambitions. The years leading up to 1914 were a golden age of frantic and profitable activity. The naval arms race with Britain was at its peak, and Krupp was at its center. The Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel was a hive of activity, launching ever larger and more powerful dreadnoughts for the Kaiser's high seas fleet. The forges in Essen worked day and night, producing the colossal naval guns and the thick, hardened armor plate for these behemoths of the sea. On land, Krupp's artillery designers were also hard at work. They developed a range of new and terrifying weapons, the most famous of which was the Type M-Gerät 420mm howitzer. It was a monster of a weapon, capable of firing a 1-ton shell over 9 kilometers. It was nicknamed Dickie Bertha, or Big Bertha, in honor of the company's heiress. The Krupp works had become a city-sized factory complex, a veritable arsenal of the empire, working at a fever pitch. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo finally lit the fuse in the summer of 1914, Krupp was ready. The Great War had begun. For the next 4 years, the Krupp industrial machine was placed entirely at the service of the German war effort. The scale of production was almost unimaginable. The factories in Essen, now employing over 150,000 people, became the beating heart of the war on the Western Front. They churned out millions upon millions of artillery shells, rifles, machine guns, and cannons of every conceivable caliber. The Big Berthas were used to smash the formidable Belgian forts at Liège, clearing the path for the German invasion of France and earning a terrifying reputation. Later in the war, Krupp engineers developed the Paris gun, a long-range supergun that could shell Paris from over 120 kilometers away, a weapon of psychological terror as much as military utility. At the Germania Werft shipyard, production shifted to the weapon that would terrorize the Atlantic, the U-boat. The company became a leading manufacturer of submarines, which waged a brutal campaign against Allied shipping. For the Krupp factories, the war was a period of frantic, profitable production. But for the German people, it was a slow descent into starvation. The British Royal Navy's blockade of German ports cut off food supplies, leading to what became known as the Turnip Winter of 1916. While Gustav Krupp dined with generals and ministers, the average German was forced to survive on a diet of turnips, sawdust-filled bread, and acorns. Hundreds of thousands died from malnutrition. This stark contrast between corporate war profits and public suffering created deep social resentment that would fester long after the guns fell silent. The war transformed not only what Krupp produced, but also the society within its gates. With millions of men conscripted into the army, Germany faced a severe labor shortage. For the first time, women, the Kruppianerinnen, were employed in heavy industry on a massive scale, working in the shell factories and foundries. The company also began to rely on forced labor, using thousands of Belgian civilians and prisoners of war to keep the production lines running, a dark and ominous foreshadowing of the far greater crimes that would be committed in the next war. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was at the center of it all, a key figure in Germany's war cabinet, coordinating industrial production and ensuring that the armies at the front were supplied with the tools of slaughter. The Krupp name was more powerful and more feared than ever before, but it all came to a crashing end in November 1918. Germany, exhausted and starved by the Allied blockade, collapsed into defeat and revolution. The Kaiser abdicated, and the war was over. For Krupp, the defeat was a cataclysm. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was designed not just to punish Germany, but to dismantle its capacity to ever wage war again. The treaty specifically targeted Krupp as the primary symbol and instrument of German militarism. Article 168 of the treaty explicitly forbade the manufacture of arms, ammunition, and war materials in Germany. Allied inspection teams arrived in Essen to supervise the destruction of machinery. Massive gun-making lathes were broken up for scrap, forges were dismantled, and thousands of pages of blueprints and technical designs were ordered to be destroyed. The company that had been the world's premier arsenal was now legally forbidden from producing its most famous and profitable products. The post-war years were a desperate struggle for survival. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Gustav had to lay off tens of thousands of workers, a painful blow to the paternalistic Kruppianer system. The proud industrial giant was forced to pivot, scrambling to find anything to produce that was not a weapon. The same factories that had built Big Bertha were now retooled to make locomotives, trucks, and agricultural machinery like tractors and plows. They produced surgical instruments, stainless steel products, and even, in a poignant symbol of their fall from grace dentures and coin-operated machines. It was a period of immense financial strain, creative desperation, and profound humiliation. Gustav, the proud industrialist, fought tooth and nail to keep the company afloat during the hyperinflation and political instability of the Weimar Republic. While publicly complying with the terms of Versailles, he played a secret, long-term game. He instructed his engineers to secretly preserve their arms-making knowledge. Key designers were sent abroad to work with foreign firms, and crucial blueprints were hidden from Allied inspectors. Gustav was determined that one day, when the time was right, Krupp's expertise in weaponry would be reborn. He was simply waiting for a new political master who would allow him to reforge the company into the arsenal it was destined to be. As the Weimar Republic began to falter under the crushing weight of the Great Depression in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the political landscape of Germany became increasingly radicalized. Gustav Krupp, like many of his fellow industrialists, watched with growing alarm. He was an old-world conservative, a monarchist at heart, who despised the chaotic mess of Weimar democracy. He feared the growing power of the Communist Party and the trade unions, which he saw as a mortal threat to his company and his class. It was in this climate of fear and uncertainty that he first encountered Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party. Initially, Gustav looked down on the Nazis. He saw them as a vulgar, thuggish, and socially inferior street movement. Hitler, the failed artist and corporal, was not the sort of man the aristocratic Gustav would normally associate with. However, as the Nazis' power grew, Gustav's perspective began to shift. He saw in Hitler a man who shared his hatred of communism and the Treaty of Versailles. More importantly, he heard a man who promised to restore order, to smash the unions, and most enticingly of all, to rearm Germany. For a man whose company was legally barred from its most profitable business, this was an irresistible promise. The pragmatic industrialist began to see the vulgar rabble-rouser as a potential savior. Gustav Krupp may have personally disliked Hitler's vulgarity, but he saw him as a tool to restore his company's fortunes and Germany's power. He made a business decision, a pact with a devil who promised him everything he wanted. The pact was sealed on a specific date, February 20th, 1933. In a secret meeting at Hermann Göring's residence, Adolf Hitler met with Gustav Krupp and 24 of Germany's most powerful industrialists. The notes from that meeting, later used as evidence at Nuremberg, captured Hitler's chilling pitch. He told them that democracy and a strong economy were incompatible. He promised to eliminate the trade unions and smash the political left. His goal, he said, was to restore the power of the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces. In return, he asked for one thing: unconditional financial support for the upcoming final election. The industrialists agreed. A fund of 3 million Reichsmarks was pledged on the spot, with Gustav Krupp as a key contributor. It was the moment German big business officially signed on to bankroll the Nazi seizure of power. From that moment on, Krupp's fate was sealed. When Hitler was appointed chancellor just days later and quickly consolidated his power, Gustav Krupp was perfectly positioned to reap the rewards. The desperate struggle for survival was over. A new terrifying era of opportunity was dawning. The forges of Essen, long dormant or repurposed for the mundane tools of peace, were about to be rekindled, ready to once again arm a resurgent Germany for a war that would dwarf all others. The year 1933 dawned, and with it, the dawn of a new, terrifying era for Germany and for the House of Krupp. The pact made in the smoke-filled rooms of Berlin bore fruit almost immediately. After Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor and swiftly began his consolidation of total power, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was showered with honors and authority. He, the man who had once looked down on Hitler as a vulgar upstart, was now one of the regime's most crucial industrial pillars. He was appointed chairman of the newly reorganized Reich Association of German Industry, a position that effectively made him the czar of the German economy. He oversaw the systematic destruction of the trade unions, a long-held dream of German industrialists, and their replacement with the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front. Gustav, in turn, delivered what Hitler wanted most, the complete and utter mobilization of German industry for the secret and then open task of rearmament. The long, frustrating years of the Versailles Treaty were over. For Krupp, it was as if a great, profitable darkness had been unleashed. Initially, the rearmament was conducted under a veil of subterfuge. The Treaty of Versailles was still technically in effect, and open defiance was a risk. So the Krupp works began to produce weapons disguised as something else. The first tanks, the light Panzer I, were designated Landwirtschaftlicher Schlepper, or agricultural tractors. Artillery designs were developed under the guise of industrial equipment. At the Germania Werft shipyard, U-boat sections were secretly constructed and stockpiled, ready for rapid assembly. Gustav's son, Alfred Krupp, who was now taking an increasingly active role in the company, was central to these clandestine operations. An engineering graduate and a far more ideologically committed Nazi than his father, Alfred had joined the SS in 1931. He saw the Nazi mission and the Krupp mission as one and the same: to restore German power through industrial and military might. He was the perfect heir for the new era, a true believer with a deep technical understanding of arms production. In 1935, Hitler threw off the mask. He publicly repudiated the Treaty of Versailles and announced a massive program of open rearmament. For Krupp, the floodgates opened. The factories in Essen, which had been cobbled together to produce locomotives and cash registers, now roared back to their true purpose. The entire complex was re-engineered for the mass production of weapons on a scale that dwarfed even the frantic efforts of World War I. Gustav, his health beginning to decline, receded into the background, becoming more of a figurehead. The real power now lay with Alfred and a board of directors who were fully aligned with the Nazi regime. Alfred was not his father's son in temperament. He was his grandfather's. He possessed Alfred Krupp's iron will and obsession with production, but without the old patriarch's paternalistic sense of social responsibility. For Alfred, workers were not a family to be cared for. They were units of labor, cogs in the vast war machine he was building. The arsenal that Krupp produced for the Third Reich was a testament to its engineering prowess. The company was instrumental in the development and production of the Panzer tanks that would form the backbone of the Blitzkrieg. From the light Panzer I and II, they moved to the formidable Panzer IV, a reliable and effective medium tank that saw service on every front throughout the war, but perhaps their most iconic weapon was the 88mm gun. Originally designed as a Flugabwehrkanone, or anti-aircraft gun, flak, its high velocity and powerful shell made it a devastatingly effective anti-tank weapon. The 88, as it was known to terrified Allied soldiers, could destroy any tank on the battlefield from a great distance. It was a symbol of German technological superiority, and it was a Krupp design. And then there were the monsters. Driven by Hitler's obsession with gigantic war-winning superweapons, Krupps engineers pushed the boundaries of what was possible. They created the Schwerer Gustav and Dora, the largest artillery pieces ever built. These were railway guns of unimaginable scale. Each one weighed over 1,350 tons and required a crew of thousands to assemble and operate. They fired 800-millimeter shells, each weighing 7 tons, over a distance of nearly 50 kilometers. The Schwerer Gustav was used only once during the siege of Sevastopol on the Eastern Front, where its colossal shells smashed through fortresses buried deep underground. While militarily impractical, these behemoths were powerful tools of propaganda, symbols of the terrifying might of the Krupp Nazi war machine. As Germany's armies swept across Europe, Krupp followed in their wake. The company engaged in systematic, organized plundering of the industrial resources of occupied nations. Factories in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and later the vast territories of the Soviet Union were seized. Some were dismantled and their machinery shipped back to Essen. Others were integrated directly into the Krupp empire, their former owners dispossessed or forced into collaboration. This was not just business, it was economic warfare, a methodical process of stripping conquered lands of their assets to feed the insatiable hunger of the German war effort. Alfred Krupp personally supervised much of this activity, viewing it as a natural right of the conqueror. The insatiable demand for weapons created an insatiable demand for labor. As the war dragged on and more German men were sent to the front, the company faced a critical manpower shortage. The solution was as brutal as it was simple: slavery. This descent into barbarism was a gradual but deliberate process. It began with voluntary guest workers from occupied territories, who were soon subjected to harsh conditions. But as the war on the Eastern Front intensified, the system became one of open chattel slavery. Millions of civilians and prisoners of war were rounded up and shipped to Germany to work in its factories. Krupp became one of the largest and most notorious users of this slave labor. By 1944, a staggering portion of the Krupp workforce consisted of forced laborers. The company built and managed its own network of over 70 brutal labor camps, often located right next to the factories. The conditions in these camps were horrific. Tens of thousands of men and women from Russia, Poland, France, and other nations were packed into unheated, unsanitary barracks. The daily food ration was often nothing more than a thin soup and a slice of the infamous Krupp bread, a vile concoction made mostly of sawdust. Beatings by SS guards and company foremen were routine. Medical care was non-existent. Prisoners who were too weak or sick to work were often sent to concentration camps to be exterminated. The death toll from starvation, disease, and outright murder was immense. The most damning evidence of Alfred Krupp's personal complicity came from a project near the Auschwitz concentration camp. Krupp built a fuse factory there and directly requested slave laborers from the SS. He used Jewish women from the camp who were forced to work under the most appalling conditions. Alfred visited the site himself. He saw the emaciated figures, the brutal guards, the constant presence of death. His response was not one of horror, but of cold calculation. He saw these human beings as nothing more than expendable resources to be used up in the service of production. Testimony from survivors and German doctors at the subsequent Nuremberg trials painted an irrefutable picture of this system. Dr. Wilhelm Jaeger, a physician, testified to the subhuman conditions, describing prisoners as walking skeletons who were worked until they collapsed and died. This was the human cost of Krupp's steel. The horror of Krupp's slave labor system is best understood not through statistics, but through the cold, bureaucratic process of evil and the stories of its victims. It began with paperwork. Memos flew between the Krupp corporate headquarters in Essen and the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, the agency that ran the concentration camps. Krupp managers would file formal requests for human material. They specified the number of units needed, the skills required. The SS would reply with transportation schedules and invoices. Human beings were reduced to entries on a ledger. Consider the story of one such unit. A Jewish woman, perhaps a doctor or teacher from Krakow, rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. In 1943, she is selected not for the gas chambers, but for work. She is transported to Krupp's new fuse factory, built just meters from the crematorium. Her job is to handle delicate machinery, working 12-hour shifts with barely any food. Her supervisor is not an SS guard, but a civilian Krupp foreman. If she is too slow, he beats her. If she collapses from exhaustion, she is sent back to the camp to be replaced by another unit. She sees the smoke from the chimneys every day. This was not a system imposed upon Krupp. This was a system Krupp actively built and managed for profit. And at the top of this system was Alfred Krupp. Testimony from the Nuremberg trials confirmed he personally visited the Auschwitz factory site. He walked past the emaciated figures. He saw the conditions. His response, recorded by his own staff, was not one of horror. It was a complaint about production delays. In 1943, as a reward for his unwavering service to the Reich, Hitler bestowed upon Alfred Krupp an extraordinary honor. He issued a special decree known as the Lex Krupp, or Krupp Law. This law converted the company from a public stock corporation back into a private family firm, with Alfred as the sole owner. It was an unprecedented move, making Alfred the personal proprietor of the largest industrial enterprise in the Nazi Empire, exempt from normal laws and shareholder oversight. It was the ultimate prize for his loyalty, cementing his status as one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. His fortune built on the plunder of Europe and the lives of over 100,000 slave laborers. But the empire forged in fire was destined to end in fire. From 1943 onwards, the Allied bombing campaign began to systematically target Germany's industrial heartland. The Krupp works in Essen, the very forge of the Reich, became a primary target. Wave after wave of British and American bombers rained destruction down upon the city. The massive factory complexes were turned into a twisted moonscape of rubble and steel. Production was forced into underground bunkers or dispersed to smaller hidden locations. The once mighty industrial machine began to grind to a halt. The end came in April 1945, when American troops fought their way into the ruins of Essen. They found a scene of utter devastation, and amidst the rubble they found the survivors of the Krupp slave labor camps, emaciated skeletal figures who bore silent, horrifying witness to the crimes that had been committed there. The Krupp directors were quickly rounded up. Gustav, now senile and frail, was placed under arrest, but the main prize was his son. American soldiers drove to the one building that had miraculously survived the bombing almost unscathed, the Villa Hugel. There, amidst the opulent splendor his great-grandfather had built, they found Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. He was arrested, no longer the master of a continental empire, but a suspected war criminal. The Devil's Forge had been extinguished. The long, bloody saga of Krupp's service to the Third Reich was over. The day of reckoning was at hand. The year 1945 marked Germany's Stunde Null, the 0 hour. The war was over, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a nation grappling with the moral abyss of the Third Reich. Amidst the rubble, the victorious Allies faced a monumental task, not just to rebuild, but to render justice. The world had witnessed the horrors of the concentration camps, and the demand for a reckoning was absolute. While the main Nuremberg trial focused on the top Nazi political and military leaders, it was clear that the regime's crimes had been enabled, and in many cases executed, by another powerful group, Germany's industrialists, and no name was more synonymous with the industrial heart of the Nazi war machine than Krupp. The initial plan was to prosecute the frail and senile Gustav Krupp, the patriarch who had made the original pact with Hitler. But he was declared medically unfit to stand trial and died in 1950, a broken man who escaped the final judgment of the court. The full weight of the family's and the company's legacy of crime therefore fell squarely upon the shoulders of his son, Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. He became the principal defendant in what was officially titled the United States of America versus Alfred Krupp et al., more commonly known as the Krupp trial. It was the 10th of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, held from December 1947 to July 1948. In the dock alongside Alfred were 11 other high-ranking Krupp directors. This was not just a trial of men, it was a trial of a system, an attempt to hold accountable the corporate architects of the war. The charges were laid out in a damning indictment. The defendants were accused of crimes against peace for their role in planning and waging a war of aggression, and, most chillingly, crimes against humanity for the systematic use of slave labor and the plunder of occupied territories. While the charge of waging aggressive war was complex and difficult to prove against industrialists, the evidence for the other charges was overwhelming, irrefutable, and horrific. The prosecution, led by American Telford Taylor, presented a mountain of evidence, meticulously assembled from Krupp's own captured company records. These were not vague accusations, they were detailed memos, production reports, and correspondence that laid bare the company's direct and willing participation in the slave labor system. The courtroom drama was intense. Survivors of the Krupp labor camps were brought in to testify. They spoke of the Krupp bread made of sawdust, the routine beatings, the freezing barracks, and the ever-present specter of death. Their harrowing personal stories gave a human face to the cold, bureaucratic evil documented in the company's files. Dr. Wilhelm Jaeger, a German physician who had attended to the laborers, provided shocking medical testimony, describing the prisoners as walking skeletons and detailing the lethal consequences of the deliberate policy of starvation and overwork. Against this, Alfred Krupp and his co-defendants mounted their defense. They did not and could not deny that slave labor had been used. Instead, they argued that they had been forced into it by the Nazi state, a defense known as state compulsion. They portrayed themselves as patriots who had no choice but to follow the orders of the regime in a time of total war. Alfred claimed he was a simple businessman, unaware of the worst atrocities, a man who had merely tried to keep his company afloat and serve his country. He presented an image of stoic, detached responsibility, admitting the facts but denying any personal moral guilt. But the prosecution systematically dismantled this defense. They produced documents signed by Alfred himself, showing his direct involvement in requesting slave laborers from the SS, his personal inspections of facilities, and his constant drive to increase production regardless of the human cost. On July 31st, 1948, the verdicts were delivered. One director was acquitted. The remaining 11 were found guilty of crimes against humanity. The sentences ranged from 3 to 12 years in prison. Alfred Krupp, as the man at the top, received the heaviest sentence. He was condemned to 12 years in prison, and in a stunning and unprecedented verdict, the court ordered the forfeiture of his entire personal fortune and the confiscation of the vast Krupp industrial empire. For a moment, it seemed that justice had been served. The Cannon King's heir was a convicted war criminal, his dynasty broken, his empire seized. The name Krupp, it appeared, was finished for good, but history rarely follows a straight line. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, the political landscape of the world shifted dramatically. The wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union had shattered, replaced by the icy hostility of the Cold War. The new enemy was not Nazism, but communism. The Berlin blockade and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 created a new strategic imperative: the urgent need to build a strong, stable, and economically powerful West Germany to serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. In this new reality, the stringent policies of denazification and the punishment of industrial war criminals began to seem like a luxury the West could no longer afford. The key figure in this great reversal was John J. McCloy, the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany. McCloy, a powerful and pragmatic lawyer and diplomat, was tasked with guiding West Germany towards sovereignty. He came to believe that a lasting reconciliation required an end to the war crimes, trials, and a measure of clemency. He argued that keeping men like Krupp in prison was a source of German resentment, and that their industrial expertise was vital for rebuilding the German economy, and by extension, for the defense of Western Europe. On January 31, 1951, McCloy issued a sweeping and deeply controversial amnesty. He dramatically reduced the sentences of many convicted Nazi war criminals. Among those granted clemency were the 10 imprisoned Krupp directors. Their sentences were commuted to time served. Most shockingly of all, McCloy reversed the court's order for the forfeiture of Alfred Krupp's property. The Krupp empire was to be returned to him. The decision was met with a storm of international protest. Critics were appalled that a convicted war criminal, a man whose fortune was built on the backs of slaves, would be allowed to walk free and regain his immense wealth. For the survivors of his camps, it was a profound betrayal, a clear signal that political expediency had triumphed over justice. But McCloy's decision stood. Alfred Krupp was released from Landsberg prison. After a complex negotiation with the Allies, which required him to split off the company's coal and steel assets, he formally regained control of the vast Krupp engineering and manufacturing conglomerate in 1953. The king had returned to his throne. Under Alfred's renewed leadership, the Krupp company rose from the ashes with astonishing speed, becoming a key player in West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. Shifting its focus away from armaments, the company became a global leader in heavy engineering, steel construction, and manufacturing. Alfred, the convicted war criminal, was once again one of the most powerful and respected industrialists in Europe. His later life was a study in ambiguity. He never issued a formal public apology for his role in the Third Reich, maintaining a dignified but unrepentant silence. Yet his actions spoke of a desire for a different kind of atonement. Before his death in 1967, he made a decision that would change the course of the company forever. Having no heir willing to take over the business, he arranged for the creation of the Alfred Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach Foundation. In his will, he bequeathed his entire fortune and the sole ownership of the Krupp company to this new foundation, tasking it with using its profits for the public good to support science, education, arts, and health care. With this single act, he ended 4 centuries of direct family control, transforming the Krupp empire from a private dynasty into a massive philanthropic engine. In the decades that followed, the company continued to evolve. In 1999, in a move that would have been unthinkable to the old patriarchs, Krupp merged with its historic rival Thyssen to form the modern industrial giant ThyssenKrupp AG. The company has continued to grapple with its dark past. In the late 1990s, it became a founding member of a German industrial initiative that created a multi-billion-dollar fund to finally provide financial compensation to former slave laborers. The name Krupp, once a symbol of German military aggression, is now associated with high-tech elevators, submarines, and industrial engineering. And so, our story comes to a close. The Krupps saga, from Arndt the blacksmith to the vast Thyssen-Krupp conglomerate, stands as a stark testament to the dual nature of human endeavor, the capacity for incredible innovation and the potential for horrific moral failure. They built an empire of steel, a symbol of German industrial might. Yet that empire was ultimately reforged in the fires of Nazi aggression and fueled by the suffering of hundreds of thousands. The Cannon King and his descendants soared to unimaginable heights, transforming the very fabric of industry only to plummet into the abyss of war crimes. Their rapid post-war recovery, while demonstrating resilience, also underscores the chilling truth that geopolitical interests can at times eclipse the demands of justice. The cost of fueling Hitler for the Krupps was not just financial, but a profound and eternal stain on their name. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, responsibility, and the enduring echoes of history. It reminds us that innovation without ethics is a dangerous path, and that true progress must always be measured not just by what we build, but by the human cost of its creation. The legacy of Krupp is a powerful, painful lesson that the pursuit of empire, unchecked by conscience, can lead to unspeakable tragedy, a story of steel and shadow that will be remembered as long as we dare to look into the darkest corners of our past.